cortex of the kidney contains the first capillary bed where filtration takes place. This capillary bed is called the glomerulus, but the glomerulus is wrapped in a double-layer serous membrane with fluid in between those two layers. This is the same structure that the pleura of the lungs had or the pericardium of the heart. I just want to show you here that this is the cortex of the kidney up here, and that this is the medulla of the kidney down here, right? So look at where I am here on the kidney, and look at this diagram here. And now look at how my two diagrams are simply only of the renal corpuscle. There's a visceral layer of the renal corpuscle, but that visceral layer hugs the fenestrated capillary that's in there. There is an outer parietal layer, which is made up of simple squamous cells. Between the visceral and the parietal layer is a capsular space. We'll give that purple. So here's my capsular space right there. All of these structures, the glomerulus, which is the name for the capillary bed, the visceral layer, which has the name of podocytes, that capsular space that's filled with filtrate, and then the parietal layer of those simple squamous cells are all collectively called the renal corpuscle. Histologically, the renal corpuscle kind of looks like a little bullseye scattered in the cortex of the kidney, only in the cortex. That capsular space is usually very easy to identify on histological sections. The glomerulus, with its visceral layer, is contained within that capsular space. And then bounding or containing that capsular space is a very, very thin layer of simple squamous cells surrounding that bullseye. The glomerulus is the specific name that we give the first capillary bed that blood experiences infiltration. The glomerulus is fed by an afferent arteriole, just like any other capillary bed. This afferent arteriole comes off of the cortical radiate artery. What makes the glomerulus special is that it is drained not by a venule, but by an efferent arteriole. This drainage vessel is called the efferent arteriole because it leads blood away from the glomerulus, but it also leads it to a second capillary bed that blood will then experience. Recall from our section on blood vessels that there were three types of capillaries: continuous, which were the most common, fenestrated, which we have here, and sinusoidal, which we saw in the liver. Fenestrated capillaries have relatively large intercellular clefts compared to the more common continuous capillaries. However, fenestrated capillaries' intercellular clefts were not as large as sinusoidal capillaries that allowed things as big as red blood cells to escape. The glomerulus contains a fenestrated capillary that is very specifically sized to allow anything smaller than albumin to escape. So if you're larger than albumin, you're not going anywhere. The glomerulus is wrapped in a visceral layer, which is made up of specific cells that we call podocytes. The word, or the root word, podo, means foot. Podo, pedo, pedo, pedal. These cells, podocytes, they wrap around the fenestrated capillary, kind of forming like a second filtration layer. Podocytes have these feet that come together, kind of like intertwined fingers. they form these little filtration slits through which anything trying to escape from the capillary bed would have to fit. But again, anything smaller than the protein albumin would fit. Anything larger just ends up staying in the fenestrated capillary. Blood enters this capillary bed by the afferent arteriole. It then pings around and it circulates in the glomerulus. And things that are smaller than albumin, they end up escaping from the fenestrated capillary into that capsular space between the visceral and parietal layers. So they have to escape that fenestrated capillary and the filtration slits of the podocytes. Those substances that can escape like that, they end up in the capsular space, and then that capsular space is drained by the proximal convoluted tubule, where the filtrate will exchange again with another capillary bed. We will work with this diagram again as we identify more structures that are actually present in the renal corpuscle. The afferent arteriole is bringing blood into the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole is carrying the blood away. The glomerulus in these two more enhanced pictures has red blood cells contained within it. It also has simple squamous cells bounding the fenestrated capillary with intercellular clefts between them. The podocytes in these cross sections of the diagrams are blue. Remember, these podocytes and the fenestrated capillaries are the structures through which something would have to move if it wanted to be filtered out of the blood and ultimately enter into the urine. These two layers of cells are the boundary between what's in the blood and what's going to be excused from the body. This is called the filtration membrane. Remember that fluid-filled space bounded by the simple squamous epithelial cells of the parietal layer of the capsule. Well, remember those now. This capsule is filled with all kinds of small stuff that escaped from the glomerulus. All of this in here, this is not urine. This is actually called filtrate. It has to go through a second capillary bed and exchange with blood again in order to make the ultimate urine that's excused or excreted from the body.